Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of The Lift. I'm Tyra Sellers, and
I'm Linda LeBlanc.
And we're also joined today with a special guest, Dr. Florence DiGennaro Reed, who's going to help us talk a little bit about the content in Chapter 5, using a competency-based approach to supervision from the book, but also probably other great stuff too. So before we jump into chatting, let me just introduce you, if that's okay, Flo.
Sure, of course.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Florence DiGennaro Reed is a professor and chairperson of the Department of Applied Behavioral Science at the University of Kansas. She is also director of the Performance Management Lab, which sounds super cool. She's a BCBA, probably a BCBAD, right?
Yes.
Yes, a BCBAD. Her research, which if y'all haven't read any of it, you need to get up on that right now. It focuses on staff training, effective and efficient staff training, performance management. It's been definitely influential in my work personally. So thank you for that, Flo. And she has published a truckload of articles, chapters, books. She gives back to our profession in science by serving on the editorial board of a bunch of different prominent journals: JABA, Journal of Behavioral Education, Behavior Analysis and Practice, the Psychological Record, School Psychology Review, that's a lot, and is also an associate editor for the Journal of Behavioral Education and Behavior Analysis and Practice. So without further ado, welcome, Flo.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yay! How about if you start off just telling us a little bit about kind of what's going on in your world these days?
Sure. As the world is opening back up, we're spending more time in physical space with people, which has been lovely, and doing more hands-on training and less remote training. Our research slowed down a little bit, but we're back at it again, doing a bit of telehealth and in-person research, and classes are Zooming, and I'm doing well. It's been a busy year.
That's amazing. I'm so glad that you could make time to join us.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Linda, did you want to start us off maybe talking about the quote and the general topic that we're going to dive into today?
Yes, I'd love to. Well, this quote for this chapter is one that I like a lot. And it says, "I've always looked at my competencies before accepting any responsibilities." And that is by our Narayana Murthy. So that notion of looking at what you can do before you take on duties, responsibilities, that really speaks to the ethics of our field and the ethical responsibility for a supervisor to help their supervisee become competent, not just to accrue the hours. And so this chapter is really about taking responsibility for a systematic competency-based approach and taking responsibility to provide all of the feedback and support that you need to provide in order to help your supervisee become ready for that independent practice. The full scope of things that we might teach is way too large to just think you're going to do it off the top of your head. You have to have a thoughtful competency-based approach, and just the task list isn't going to get you there. That's a list of things that are important, but it is not necessarily exactly all that a person needs to do when they're practicing independently. So identifying those valued outcomes in the workplace and then setting a plan to help people develop those skills and moving through a bit of a curriculum is a critical part of effective supervision. And I know that this is something that is very linked to a lot of your research, Flo, in terms of really identifying what kind of repertoires are needed to be successful, to be proficient even, and then finding a way to systematically go through those things. What did you think about this chapter?
First, I loved this book, and I also loved this chapter. A lot of my emphasis has been, and things that I've spent some time thinking about, has been on what are practical ways we can accomplish what we need to accomplish, right? And be successful so that folks are delivering high level, high quality services in an ethical way, and to adopt some of the language in this book in a culturally responsive way. You know, and our field is new to talking about some of those latter concepts. We're sort of behind the 8 ball with respect to that relative to other fields. And so what I really loved about this book is, in many ways, it sort of created a roadmap for supervisors, and cited relevant research that influenced your recommendations. And it took some of the mystery out of what to do, particularly this chapter, right? So it's talking about process to achieve desired outcomes. So I thought this chapter was fantastic.
I think I view this was a real meat and potatoes chapter. Here's what you need to do. Here's how you need to do it. Here's what Mager says about how to kind of establish all of your specific targets. And so I do hope that it provides people with a lot of guidance. I have heard some people say it feels awfully daunting once their eyes are open to the fact that, oh, it's not just the hours and the task list. This is really bigger than that, which, I mean, that's a real response. It is a big thing to provide this kind of supervision, particularly if you feel like you're in it alone. It's one of the reasons why we chose that name, The Lift, for this podcast. We haven't had a lot of resources in the field. And as we make more resources, particularly practical ones that give you the roadmap, hopefully it becomes a little easier to do the right thing and to do it well.
I agree. And, you know, I was sort of thinking as I was listening to both of you talk about maybe the focus or impact of this chapter, I sort of, sitting from this perspective, I sort of thought about this chapter as sort of like a duh chapter. Like, obviously you would need to, you know, kind of know what it is that you're going to do with your supervisees and have it planned out and think about mastery criteria and things like that. But, you know, that's me with pushing 30 years experience. And that was a kind of a jerk response from me, I think, in this moment, because as I continue to listen to you both, I thought back to my early years of supervising, and I didn't have a plan, and I had to slowly build one over the years because I didn't have the money or the resources or the time to create everything for a supervisee or a trainee all at once. So I sort of started taking a systematic approach with each interaction with a supervisee. I would try some things. If it worked well, I would sort of, you know, write it up in a spreadsheet and add that to my list of tasks that I would do with folks and tweak it along the way. And, you know, I didn't think about necessarily the terminal context at first when I was working on teaching things with my supervisees. And I certainly didn't think about things like, you know, I really need to get to know and interview this person and think about where do they see themselves in their career, because that's going to shape and change what I focus on and how much emphasis I put on different skills, right? Some are pivotal and you got to have these and you got to be solid and fluent and master these things. But if you're never, ever, ever perceiving that you're going to work in severe problem behavior, maybe I don't care that I get you to, you know, super uber competent with functional analyses. Maybe you need to know about it, but I don't want to spend my time focusing on those things. So I really appreciated listening to both of you, because that reminded me, like, wait a minute, Tyra, you haven't always been where you are right now. So, you know, thinking about how newer folks might be perceiving this chapter.
If you don't mind me jumping in real quick and
Not at all.
a personal story, I had the same reaction years ago, that a competency-based approach, like, kind of like, duh, yeah. Then I gave a talk at a state chapter, and it was about using behavioral skills training and pretty simple performance management strategies. And as I left the stage, I had a group of people following me. I felt like a rock star, right? Like I had this group wanting to talk to me, and I went, okay, this is needed. So I really became laser focused for years to just keep talking about this. And I worry sometimes like, okay, people know this, I'm done talking about it. And then something happens where I'm like, okay, yeah, behavior analysts regularly adopt a competency-based approach to teach skills to clients or learners. But there's this gap in like a
It's like a failure to generalize.
Yeah.
Somehow us grown people as trainees are different enough as a stimulus that we're too far along the gradient. We do not.
Yep. And so I think this chapter is so valuable because it doesn't assume that people who are agreeing to take on this really important responsibility that they need to take seriously. And yes, it's effortful, it's daunting, it's a lot of work. It sort of breaks it down into very straightforward activities that someone needs to engage in to do it successfully.
I love that story so much. And I love the sort of like, let's remember, we are behavior analysts. We use our technology for, let's say you work, with individuals with intellectual disabilities, and you wouldn't just sort of like, well, I don't know, I'm going to do some stuff with this client. You would really like assess what are their needs, and kind of plan things out. And so I wonder if we could chat a little bit about the idea that a supervisor taking on a trainee doesn't necessarily mean you are accepting in that moment to cover every single thing on the task list in depth, because you might not have the resources to do that. You might not have the expertise to do that. You might not be the only supervisor providing supervision for this person, or you might not have them for 1,500, 2,000 hours. You might only have them for a little bit. So the idea that you don't try to shove more into less time, but be purposeful. And this is something that we do with clients as well, right? We don't say, I'm going to help you with everything in your life. We look at what are the critical needs? What are the resources? Perhaps we're doing a very narrow focused programming with a client where we're just working on, toilet training and some social skills or something, versus a comprehensive program with someone. And I think, again, to use your sort of tool of comparing what we do with our trainees, at least in terms of use of our technology with our clients, like that's important. Supervisors should be thinking about what actually is going to be my focus for this trainee. And it's not going to be the same for every trainee, probably.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And, it could be that the supervisee comes with some skills already. And so just like if you took on a client, you wouldn't assume that there were no skills. You would assess. The idea of do a self-assessment or have the supervisee do a self-assessment. And for some of those, kind of compare that to your observation or judgment. That allows you to target some things that aren't on the task list, like accurate self-assessment. And, those are some important competencies as well, not just things on the task list, but that notion of being able to identify where you are with respect to your mastery of the task list. We are capable of teaching ourselves. And that means that if you can support someone to be capable in identifying where they're already pretty good at something and where they have some deficits, and to be focused towards some of those deficits, as opposed to, I'm just going to do the things I'm already really good at, then you set them up to be able to acquire the rest of the skills that you don't have the time to focus on. So for me, it's about knowing, okay, which parts of this task list am I going to be best suited to work with you on? and I'm going to teach you how to be a great reflector, a great self-assessor, and to find your resources to acquire new skills independently. One of the things that's not on the task list at all, and we really didn't even talk about in the book, but I do think is important. Not everyone does, and the logistics don't always support it. But I think it's important for supervisees to have experiences with a broad range of populations. And the fact that most people are getting their experience hours as part of a job, and the job is probably with one population, I think means that we are generally having new BCBAs that have a more limited range of experience. They haven't worked in foster care and out-of-home services, dementia care, adult residential, general school settings. I'm not saying we need a task list for that, but I do think that notion of its multiple exemplar training, and it helps you to apply those items from the task list a little more broadly, because you see how the same tools can be used to target a much broader array of different kinds of skills. What are your thoughts on that notion of a diversity of populations or settings or training experiences?
I'll jump in if you don't mind, Tyra. I love it. And it reflects conversations I've had with my colleagues here at KU. I remember going through my pre-doctoral internship at the May Institute, and they baked into the experience rotations. So you had to experience different settings and populations and whatnot. And I don't think we do enough of that in behavior analysis. And I remember going from working with young kids with autism to accepting a position with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and thinking, wait, what do you mean I can't just give them access to the TV when they've earned it, right? They have a right to watch their TV in their own home. And, you know, like just really thinking about that, this is a different ball game. And there's lots of things in adult services that are completely different than children's services, and different populations. You're approaching service delivery differently. So I think that would be fantastic. Firstly. Secondly, going back to your conversation about self-assessment, I've always felt a little unsure about how I feel about it, and I've started adopting that just this past spring. And one thing that I do like about it is I can have a supervisee perform beautifully on all the checklist items I have, and I can even sit back and stop using my checklist and just sort of take in the whole gestalt of it, and how is the performance going, and how are they doing? And they can still report that they feel uncomfortable with performing that procedure. And just looking at their performance would never reveal that. So that self-assessment,
it's both competence and confidence.
Yeah. And so then it evokes a conversation that we can have around why is that, and we can take a functional approach to addressing that.
Yeah. Let's see. I have two kind of thoughts. One that is directly related with the kind of diversity of practice or subspecialty areas, and then another that I just have kind of a question about that relates to a point Linda made earlier. So my first kind of, statement is I totally agree that getting multitude of experiences, even if only brief, even if you're only exposed for a few weeks, is so critical and amazing. At the same time, I think many of our folks that are, going through their fieldwork experience hours are also earning a living, and they might not have access to the ability to do that. They also might be doing an online program. They may be in a geographically remote or less populated area. And so while I think that's kind of the gold standard, I don't know that it's achievable for everybody, but that makes me think like, okay, cool, that's fine. Behavior analysis is all about looking at the environmental variables and arranging them for maximum outcome, right? So like in the instance that you cannot give that experience to your trainees directly, there's no reason that you can't use a variety of examples. Like, don't go to the 3-year-old with autism for every example that you use and every case scenario that you use. You know, get yourself a good community of practice and meet other practitioners that work in different areas than you do, because they might be willing to let someone zoom in to see something that they otherwise wouldn't be able to see, or maybe they're willing to video, you know, getting appropriate consents. They're willing to videotape something, a context, a setting, a technology that otherwise wouldn't be available. You also can access, you know, just scholarly work from other subspecialty areas. And I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but there's a set of videos, the ABA subspecialty resources on the BACB's website. And there are videos and PDF summaries, great resources, because I'm finding that a lot of new folks don't even know about the different applications. And so that's another thing that supervisors can kind of fold into what they're doing. So that's just my add-on to that. Like, yes, it's incredibly valuable, and it's not enough just to say, well, I don't live in an area where I can access that kind of graduate training experience, or as a supervisor, I don't have access to enough settings where I could have people do rotations. Like, that's okay. We often don't have the most optimal resources available to us, but you can still think functionally, how do I approximate that? The other point and kind of question is when we're talking about creating like the scope of what it is that we're covering, Linda, you said something that was really important relative to client programming, is that we sort of take the relevant contingencies and into consideration. In other words, we are going to find out what we think someone needs, a client might need to increase, and we're also going to ask them, right? We're finding out from the client, from the stakeholder, what's important to them. Is that important to do in our supervisory relationships? Do we make space for the trainee to nominate and direct to some degree what they're interested in? And, you know, if so, why do we do that?
Yeah, well, I think we have to, because they have access to data that we don't. And much like Flo was saying, you can have seen them do a skill well and not realize that they don't feel very confident in that skill unless you ask them. And I also think that you won't have access to their covert behavior related to their preferences if you don't ask them. I mean, there are core things everyone needs to know, but that notion of even getting someone to think about which ones would I like to work on and why, you're kind of building a higher order skill in and of itself. And if we take that approach of like, we're just going to go down the list in order, and like, you're going to, you know, you do the next one, I think you can really set up a situation where the supervisee or trainee kind of feels like their training and supervision is happening to them, rather than that they are fully engaged in kind of helping to drive that train and adding in that additional information, which is really all about the social validity of the targets and the extent to which various skills or ideas are going to feel useful to them. Now, I will say this. There are some that I'm like, you know, it's not like we're talking about castor oil, but it's good for you. And we are going to talk about the underlying philosophical principles of science. And we're going to talk about how, you know, you take that skeptical science-minded approach and, you know, you think about empiricism when you do things that are consistent with it. I wouldn't expect some trainee to come along and say, I'd really like to delve into empiricism and skepticism, that'll be on me. But there are a broad range of things that they could convey some of their interests and preferences for. And, you know, having a list of topics and a curriculum as a starter helps them know the things they wouldn't think of, helps you know the things that you wouldn't think of. And I think it holds the supervisor accountable to not just cover the things they really like that they feel really comfortable with, but also because we naturally do that. We approach those things that have a very strong success history, and we avoid the ones where we've had very little experience in the absence of some rules and goal directedness. So for me, the curriculum is not only for the supervisee or trainee, it's for the supervisor. And in prior chapters, we talk a little bit about how the process of supervision keeps you sharp, helps you grow as a supervisor. And I think that's one of the ways that it does. You have that supervisee self-assess. Well, that's not going to hinder you from doing a little self-assessment as well. And from also noticing that if the supervisee is nominating some skills or topic areas where you're like, ooh, maybe that's something to take action on. So yeah, I do think there's an important role for involving that supervisee in identifying what you're going to work on.
Linda, you said it beautifully. I agree with everything you said. I would add two really minor comments. I see the supervision process as helping the supervisee to reach the career they desire. And so seeking or soliciting their input helps you create opportunities so that that actually can happen. And then also one thing I've enjoyed as part of the supervision process is my ongoing learning. And so even soliciting input on measurement of core competencies, maybe not for an early supervisee that might lack those skills, but sometimes people come to supervision after working in the field for a while, yes. Or if they're more advanced and later on in their supervision experience, sometimes some of the questions where they just ask the simple question, you're like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Or they actually have recommendations and they've thought carefully about it. It's a learning process for me as well. And so creating the conditions under which supervisees would be comfortable having input, I think is important. And that partially comes from asking them to nominate content.
I love that. And that just wraps, that whole comment wraps like its arms around the entire theme of the book, which is this is a relationship that is collaborative, that is bidirectional. It's not a transaction. It's not, you know, a dictatorship. And the idea that both the individuals, you know, have something to gain and have some risk involved is so important. And you just kind of summed it all up perfectly.
Well, I hope you won't mind if I switch the topic just a little bit and we take this opportunity to talk about feedback. I love talking about feedback, and Flo is a scholar in this area. And it's, you know, it's one of those things where it seems almost universal that people have histories with feedback that lead them to not only want to avoid receiving it, but even to avoid giving it. And you can get into a real pickle if you have a supervisor and a supervisee that are both avoidant of feedback. There's going to be almost no learning occurring there. You know, it's one of the reasons why and in fact, in a next version of the book, we're thinking about actually breaking an entirely separate chapter out on feedback, because it can be so difficult to navigate, and those escape and avoidance contingencies can be so subtle that we don't even realize we're doing it, that we're kind of giving away our best tool for affecting change. And so we suggest that you have to, like, day one, talk about feedback, why it matters, you know, how do you want it? What's your history been? Is that something that you typically do? And what have been your observations about feedback and people's history with it?
I have had the same experiences, and that is the number one thing when I speak or do workshops or just consult with agencies and I'm interacting with staff. People are uncomfortable giving feedback and often struggle with receiving or accepting it. And so there's this avoidance situation, and that doesn't do anybody any good, and it harms clients. So we have to figure out how to, like, potentially can harm clients. We have to figure out how to address this. I love that you included feedback scripts to set the stage for that. And I do the same thing, whether it's in a BCBA supervision relationship or with graduate students on my team. The very first day we meet and they join the team, or I start the supervision relationship, that's the conversation we have. And in fact, I even do it earlier, where I talk about the culture of the team and how there's just feedback flying all over the place. It's going in every direction and everyone's giving it and receiving it. And I try to frame it as we are invested in your success, and we're all invested, and we're only as strong as the weakest member. And so we have to lift each other up. So the fact that you use lift for the podcast, I think I love that. So including that content in the chapter, I think will be really helpful for readers, and breaking that out into a separate chapter, I think people really struggle with it. So I think that's a great idea.
Well, and I think most people don't really reflect on what their full learning history with feedback is. Although if you poked them to reflect on it, they can identify some of those salient events. And I think particularly with high achievers, people who are pleasers, who want to do well, you know, even small, reasonably presented indications that they didn't do it perfectly can be crushing. And so what I often find is that, I walked that road myself and was perhaps far too sensitive to corrective feedback. So I certainly can identify with that and talk with supervisees about that. But I will say this, as I was becoming, about to get my PhD, I had inadvertently really imitated some harsh, more direct, not as supportive feedback patterns. And I was lucky enough to have one of my supervisors give me feedback on my feedback. And, you know, it impacted my behavior very quickly, because I immediately saw, oh, wait a minute, I'm doing exactly what I know I didn't like someone doing to me. And I don't know that I've noticed other people doing it differently, but that doesn't mean they haven't been around. So I just kind of set myself a goal to, you know, behave differently and become better at feedback. And I now use the phrase with folks, try to become a master of feedback, to really think about, why am I saying it this way? And if I say it that way, will I change their behavior and change how they feel? So it's like every learning opportunity becomes the opportunity to change, to balance the scales on, oh, wait a minute, feedback is awesome. I want some of that.
Yeah, and they seek it out even if you happen to not give it, right? Linda, I love that you shared that story. I had a similar experience, not necessarily that I was imitating previous models, but that, I sort of have a strong personality, and grew up in New York, and so we're pretty direct and straightforward and tell people what we think. And I've had the word intimidating, even when I'm not giving feedback and I'm thinking we're just having a lovely conversation. I've received feedback myself that I can be intimidating. So I've spent a lot of time reflecting as I moved into different professional circles about how my interactions with people can be received, and whether it not only effectively changes behavior, but also continues to contribute to the development of the relationship I want to have. So
I
really
love
thinking
that
about
so
it both
much.
ways.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No.
I'm fangirling so hard over everything you're saying right now. So I'm going to shut up, but I just needed to say that. I could not contain it anymore.
No, it's fine.
Flow is awesome. Do you think that notion of you'd better reflect on what your experiences have been, or you almost become subject to them rather than being able to kind of work them into a bigger plan of change for yourself. But it is hard to give feedback in enough ways that are flexible enough for all of the different ways that people like to receive it. Some people do like direct feedback. Some people, the thing is, you've got an intermittent schedule of reinforcement for however it is you deliver it. And that idea that let me change enough of my behavior so that it's close to FR1. Like each time I give feedback, it's kind of hitting that mark of, this producing a little bit of insight and eagerness to learn for that person. In your research, have you found kind of a formula or different patterns of what people like hit me with the good stuff first? I don't want to have to wait for that shoe to drop. Tell me, give me a hug first. What do you see different, or maybe at the end?
So I'll speak in generality. So most people, when I ask, I usually, in many situations, I'll say, what do you want to hear first? Areas that need to improve, or what I was really impressed by? They almost always say the areas that need to improve. And then we get through that because they're nervous, or they want to talk about it, or they're enthusiastic about changing their behavior. There's a whole host of reasons why they would want that first. And then I make sure I say, we have to talk about things that you did well, because I want that to continue in the future. If someone's early on working with me, sometimes that can be intimidating. So I might change how I go about doing it. I try to avoid the feedback sandwich, but it's not the worst thing in the world. I just feel like it lacks authenticity if you aren't careful about how you use it. So my marker of success whenever I leave an interaction where we're discussing feedback that I have is, do they thank me when we're done? And do they express appreciation? I also make sure, one of the things I've learned over time is, if I'm engaging in covert emotional responding, that's not the time to give feedback. Wait, you need to wait. Otherwise things tend to go off rails. I don't communicate the way that I'd like. I've really liked the book Crucial Conversations, when those conversations turn in the direction you don't expect, or sometimes they just appear. That has been really helpful too, in terms of, again, staying committed to the type of relationship you want to have and your long-term goals, but also addressing the situation in the moment.
You said three things that I just want to highlight for listeners that I think are so critical and have almost nothing to do with the trainee or the supervisee. So you said, pay attention to your own responding in terms of, is this a good time to give high quality feedback? Because you may be responding to the fact that someone did something that you think I've told them 50 times, do it like this. And you're probably not in a good space to give high quality, effective feedback, or at the very least, you need to attend to that and purposefully choose to behave in a different way, right? So I love that, right? Self-reflect, self-reflect, self-reflect. Then you also said you are sort of evaluating the effects of your feedback every single time. You know, does that person, do they have an affect that suggests that this was to some degree an enjoyable interaction for them? Did they thank you? You know, other things that I look for are, do they say, okay, great, so you're going to come observe me, or you're going to send me that article, you know, follow-up things from the feedback. So those two things are so important. And then the other thing you said that I think is so brilliant, and I think if people weren't listening carefully, they could miss this. Your feedback, the parameters that you kind of play around with when you're giving feedback, you know, are you saying some sort of, you know, compassionate statement first to kind of ease into things, or are you giving them a choice, or are you just hitting them with like, hey, all right, you know, Flo, you know, I think you're awesome. There's something that I really need to talk to you about. Like maybe you're just jumping right into it. That depends on where you are in your relationship with that person, and it will change throughout your relationship. So it's not going to be the same for a trainee on day 1, day 30, day 180. And that's so important for listeners to understand, that we're constantly evolving based on the outcomes and the evolution of our relationship. So I'm so glad that you said that.
Absolutely. And the fact that when you're giving feedback, you have to keep in mind that you have goals related to their behavior and performance, and you have to have some goals related to sustaining the relationship and impacting that person in a way that maintains, sustains, and even fosters the relationship. And I think if you don't have your eye on both prizes, you might be so overly concerned about changing this behavior right now that you give away your opportunity to change all the other behaviors in the future. And once you do that, it's hard to recover it. You know, once you've been inadvertently harsh or been perceived as harsh, uncaring, dismissive, whatever it might be. And we've all had some of that kind of feedback, and probably all in a, you know, unintending, given some of that kind of feedback. It can be really difficult to recover the quality of that relationship. So having those two goals matters. And your thought about, let me think about how I'm feeling right now, is really about, am I going to be able to meet that second goal related to the ongoing health of the relationship? And if not, hold off on the first goal. You'll, wait until you can accomplish both.
And unfortunately, I learned that by making mistakes and having supervisees say, that didn't feel so good. You know, later they came to me and talked to me about it. But that is beautifully stated. And yeah, you will risk the opportunity for future behavior change. Yeah, you're right. Great. And Tyra, you were way more eloquent in pointing out some of the things I was saying. So thank you for doing that for listeners.
Well, you said it all amazingly. I just want to highlight, like, if that was like my vocal highlighter pen for everyone. I wonder, you know, in the book, we do spend a little bit of time talking about kind of different quote unquote types of feedback, or names, you know, praise versus corrective, or supportive versus corrective, or adequacy, diagnostic, and corrective. Do you think it's valuable to talk about with our trainees those different sort of flavors specifically? Like, is it helpful? And if so, why? Like, how do we leverage those labels?
I do. I don't know that we have to spend a ton of time on it. Scott Geller also uses something different. It's positive and supportive. So the corrective is called supportive, which I kind of like that. So I love that. Yeah, I've sort of tried to shift my language toward that. I like, Yeah, I think it's helpful. It's helpful for the learning process. Really, to me, it's about where the rubber meets the road. And, are you telling people how to change if they need to change, and flagging what they're doing well, no matter what you call it.
Yeah, I sort of, for me, I think it's useful in terms of getting away from like the F word as something bad, right? But also in terms of the idea that not only do I want to be effective in my feedback delivery with my trainees, but I want to teach them about feedback and how to use it. If we've talked about these different categories, I might be able to score in sort of treatment integrity or procedural integrity checklists, what kinds of feedback they're using with an RBT or something like that, so that we can shift things if needed.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point. You're right. Yeah.
But I love that. Thank you, Scott Giller. I love that idea of flipping that, right? And the supportive thing is the stuff that we're going to talk about that I need to figure out how to get you to do more of, or what have you.
Well, we're getting just to the end of our time together, which has clearly not been enough time.
Not at all.
But Flo, it's been a pleasure having you on. Anything that you've got, I know you've got a new book out, and anything you want to mention to folks that are out there listening.
And we can link in the notes to all of those wonderful things.
Oh, I appreciate that. It's an intro textbook that I wrote with my best friend and partner, Derek Reed, as well as Dr. Greg Madden. So that was published. So I'll send you the link. I did want to say one thing about the book. I've already raved about it and said that I think it's fantastic. The field desperately needed it. But it's not just, I don't think, for supervision involving someone seeking a BCBA or BCABA. I've been using pieces of it with my graduate students who are consulting with agencies, and I'm supervising their work, and I'm sort of behind the scenes helping them. And last night I actually texted someone and said, hey, Paige, whatever, use that. We were talking earlier today. I'm teaching a behavioral consultation class in the fall, and I'm going to be using pieces of it, particularly around problem solving, some of those professional repertoires. And behavioral consultants don't supervise in the same way, but a lot of the skills overlap. And so I'll be adopting it. So I want listeners to know that it has broad applicability and is really a great and desperately needed resource for the field. So I wanted to say thank you to both of you and your co-author for creating such a great resource.
Well, we'll definitely pass that along to Shala Alai, our co-author, and thank you for mentioning that. I actually, for my consulting company, do a leadership series, a leadership training series, and it covers a lot of the topics that are in the book. So I do think you're right. That those distinctions between supervisor, mentor, leader, effective manager, they blur a little bit in a good way, right? They blur together when you're doing it right. And so that's a great suggestion to think about some of the different applicability. Well, Flo, I suspect we're just going to need to have you back on again in the future. So
that would be fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks everyone for continuing to listen to The Lift. We'll see you in a future episode.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.